In March 1966, a sturdy, stocky man walked into a London pub. After a glance around the establishment, he immediately recognized the man he was looking for, who was quietly drinking behind the bar. And then, with an everyday ease and undisguised pleasure, he put 2 bullets in his head, turned to the other patrons of the bar, called out his name, and ordered them to forget everything they had just seen, and as if nothing had happened, went outside and fled in a waiting car. The man's name was Ronald Kray. He and his twin brother Reginald for more than 10 years controlled almost the entire criminal world of London. Under their protection in England worked the American mafia, and local gangsters under any pretext did not want to cross the organization of brothers called the Firm. Their connections in high places reached all the way to the House of Lords, and their reputation as ruthless killers helped create an unspoken code called the Wall of Silence, according to which no one dared to cooperate with the police, which made the brothers practically invulnerable against the law. Today, I'm going to tell you a true story that no writer could have made up. Meet Ronald and Reginald Kray on the wrong side of the law. I want to ask you to take your mind off the video for a moment and look at this cool print I made for you. If you like it, you can buy any product you like by clicking the link in the description. And of course, every item you purchase contributes to the growth and advancement of the channel. Thank you for your attention, and now let's dive deeper into the story of our hero for today. The twins were born on October 17, 1934 to the family of Violet and Charles Kray. Their upbringing was mostly with their mother and her relatives, as their father was a typical merchant who could not sit still and was constantly on the move, buying and selling various goods. He was rarely at home, but he provided for his family well, so that Violetta and her children, although she didn't live like royalty, nevertheless had a roof over their heads and means of subsistence. The neighborhood in which the brothers spent their childhood was called the East End. It was not distinguished by luxury and wealth, and was a typical working-class neighborhood. The men of the East End had for the most part only 3 choices: either to work hard at a legitimate job, or to devote themselves to boxing training and hope to make a name for themselves, which, by the way, many did, or to go into illegal businesses. The highest rung in the East End criminal hierarchy was considered villain. Villains were tough men who built their authority through numerous fights while making money from the so-called protection of small traders. Simply put, they were racketeers who fought constantly, either defending their territories or trying to reclaim new ones. This was partly similar to what Martin Scorsese demonstrated in his movie Gangs of New York. This way of life in the East End had existed for decades, and the twins had grown up on their father's stories about the villains of the past, as well as seeing the villains of their own day. Their paternal grandfather was a great street fighter and went by the nickname Crazy Jimmy Kray. He, being himself a common merchant, fought with almost all the villains of the East End, and often came out of those skirmishes victorious. His maternal grandfather was nicknamed Cannonball in his youth for his knockout punch, which he demonstrated well in boxing matches. As you can tell from what has been said before, Ronnie and Reggie grew up in an environment where the dictates of power ruled. So it's not surprising that from a very young age they began to live by the same rules. The physicality inherited from their grandfathers, which allowed them to win in fights, only confirmed to them the idea that violence could be used to achieve what they wanted. The early childhood of the twins fell during the period of the Second World War. That, however, did not prevent them from spending a lot of time on the streets, where they, imitating adult villains, staged fights with boys from neighboring streets. In every such fight, Ronnie and Reggie stood up for each other, but at the same time competed. This is how Reginald described it to writer John Pearson, who later wrote a book about them. If someone would challenge me and I would refuse, Ronnie would certainly know about it and constantly put this act in reproach. We fought as hard as we could so that the other couldn't blame him for anything. This rivalry that emerged at an early age would remain with them into adulthood, with the only caveat being that the stakes would be more than 1 order of magnitude higher. During the same period, the twins' attitudes towards law enforcement would also be formed. The residents of the East End generally had a negative attitude towards the police and in the vast majority of cases did not cooperate, solving all issues in a more familiar way, which undoubtedly influenced the views of Ronnie and Reggie in this matter. But the final establishment of anti-police views came from a more personal example for the brothers. Their father deserted from the army during the war and hid from the authorities in the East End, often visiting home. Just as often the police came for him and often caught Charles by surprise. The twins in this case had to play a distracting role so that his father had time to run away, or so that the cops did not find the place where he was hiding. As much as the underworld was a part of Ronnie and Reggie's lives, so was boxing. Their grandfather had boxed, their older brother had boxed, and the East End was filled with stories about local boxers as much as stories about local villains. It was almost a foregone conclusion that the twins would find themselves in the ring sooner or later in the same way. At their first training session, the brothers brought the grandfather along, and a few years later they were seriously talked about as the hope of the East End. Until they turned professional at the age of 16, the twins had won all their amateur bouts, which wasn't at all surprising given their childhood coach's recollections of how they felt about training. The brothers carried the rivalry I mentioned earlier with them into the sport. If, for example, Ronnie didn't want to get up for his morning run, Reggie would call him a wuss and his brother's pinched ego would force him to get out from under the covers. This rivalry made them almost fanatics of their work and allowed the brothers to give 110%. The only thing that prevented the twins from fully realizing themselves in the boxing ring was street violence, in which they plunged deeper and deeper every year. First, they were caught beating a guy with bicycle chains, after which he miraculously survived. But the witnesses were intimidated before the trial began, and Ronnie and Reggie got away with it. And then they beat up a policeman who made a small remark to them. The only thing that saved them from a real sentence in this case was a local priest's petition for leniency, and the brothers got off with a suspended sentence. However, this practically put an end to their serious boxing career, as managers in most cases refused to work with fighters who were famous for their cruelty outside the ring, especially since in the very near future they would self-sabotage absolutely all hopes for a sporting future. The manner in which the twins would wind up sneaking out of the army left them no other option but to become the next villains of the East End. This was their first serious run-in with the law, in which they made it clear that they were not going to play by anyone else's rules, under any circumstances. The story of army service, which more resembled a criminal comedy than the actual events that took place, began with the twins in March 1952. When they were called up for service in the London unit of the Royal Fusiliers. On the first day, the brothers did not particularly like the attitude and expectations of the military. Actually, they beat an officer attached to their company and nonchalantly left the location of the unit. They returned home as if nothing had happened. The police found the twins sleeping peacefully in their beds the next morning and returned them to the unit. The local military authorities decided not to make a mess of things and placed the brothers, along with other troublemakers, in their own kind of prison cell with a 1-week sentence. There, they met a thief named Dickie Morgan, and together with him, they left their place of duty again on the first day after their release. This time, they decided not to return home on a permanent basis because last time they managed to stay there only one night, and, like their father deserter, began to drop by their mother's rare forays to eat and take a nap. The rest of the time, Ronnie and Reggie spent on the streets of the East End, where Dickie Morgan, a thief since the age of 8, introduced them to the criminal world of London. The twins, together with Morgan and his fellow thieves, broke into the shops of merchants at night and stole everything they could carry. This trade allowed them to earn a little money, which was then immediately spent on drinks in local pubs, where in addition to the fun of being in a drunken frenzy, the brothers began to earn the first points toward their authority as serious street fighters. Previously known only as promising young boxers, the 18-year-olds now had joined the ranks of the East End's baddies and were ready to take on anyone who dared to challenge them. The debauched life continued for several months and was interrupted by a constable identifying them in the street. The twins were brought back to the unit and thrown into their familiar cell. And then it all happened again. Escape, capture, lockup. Then again, and again, dozens more times. In the end, during the first year of their alleged service, the Kray brothers got so annoyed that they were first put in real prison for a month for resisting arrest, and then transferred to a military unit in Kentbury, where they were kept in the local punishment cell awaiting a court-martial. And here begins the most interesting part of the Kray brothers' army history, where the twins, either from idleness or for some other reason, decided to play Charles Bronson with their guards. It started out harmlessly enough, as a sign of something ephemeral and understandable only to the twins' protest. Ronald shaved only one half of his face and refused to eat. But then, some sort of theater of absurdity and violence began. They threw food and dishes against the wall, took off all their clothes, and tore them, together with bedding, into small pieces, while constantly shouting and banging on the walls and bars of the cell. And any guard who tried to enter their cell and calm down the violent prisoners would be confronted by the fists of two well-trained boxers. They put a bucket on one guard's head and banged on it until the poor guy was dragged out of his cell by his colleagues. Another came too close to the bars and was handcuffed to them with his own handcuffs. Another one, who apparently believed in his own strength, was tied to a pole with his own belt, and while his colleagues rushed to his aid, Ronnie and Reggie managed to spread newspapers around the guard, set them on fire, and performed an improv ritual dance as if making a sacrifice. They were so disruptive, in fact, that the guards agreed to take them to the local bar and buy them a drink just so they would calm down. The peak of the madness was an escape to attend Easter dinner at their mother's house. In the course of a carefully articulated plan, the brothers and two other prisoners stole the keys to their cell, broke out, beat up twice as many guards, and escaped from the compound in a prearranged car. The only problem was that a man at large stole a car for them, which had only enough gasoline for half the journey. So the fugitives could not enjoy their mother's delicious meals, but were seized and brought back to custody. This act was the last straw for the War Office, and the tribunal was bumped up to emergency status and was held almost immediately after their capture. During the trial, Ronald and Reginald Kray were sentenced for their antics to a ridiculous 9 months in prison, as well as officially dismissed from military service. This decision suited both sides. The military no longer needed to keep soldiers who were nothing but trouble, and the Krays finally said goodbye to their despised military service. In 9 months, they got out of prison with the idea that violence is the key to all doors and started building their criminal empire, opening even the most luxurious and well-protected doors with this key. The 9-month prison term, according to the authorities, was supposed to punish the twins for their behavior, but in fact served the brothers in diametrically opposed ways. First, they regained their physical shape, which they had lost during their constant running. And secondly, they acquired more than a dozen new criminal acquaintances. The Krays came out of prison ready to immediately enter the incessant clashes of local gangs and reclaim their place in the criminal world of the East End. The petty thievery in which they had participated with Dickie Morgan during their time in the army did not suit the twins. Such a trade brought in too little money, and it was too easy to get caught. The Krays decided they needed a venture that would bring in a steady income and help make a name for themselves. Soon the twins' eyes fell on a rundown pool hall that had long since seen its best days. The establishment, called the Regal, was a bar with 14 pool tables, the main visitors of which were local gangsters who came there to get drunk, fight, and steal money from the manager. It was not clear why the place continued to exist at all. Nobody in their right mind would want to run it. No one except the Kray brothers. For them, it was the perfect venture that would kill two birds with one stone. First, by wresting the establishment away from the constant attacks of local gangs, they would show the entire East End their power. And secondly, without constant money to the racketeers, the billiard room was quite able to bring in a small but steady income. All they had to do was convince the owner of the place to hand it over, which wasn't hard. A couple of broken windows, a few antagonizations after closing, and anonymous messages to burn the bar to the ground broke the manager's patience, and he put it up for sale. At the same moment, the Kray brothers appeared and offered him £5 a week for the right to manage the billiard room. Needless to say, he gladly accepted. After getting the bar, Ronnie and Reggie made some repairs, fixed broken tables, and almost immediately after opening breathed new life into the Regal. This was largely due to the fact that there was something going on there almost every night that was the talk of a good half of the East End. Ronnie, for example, could bring in a giant and dwarves from a traveling circus, get them drunk, and talk them into putting on a show. Or he could bring in a donkey in a straw hat and convince everyone that he could teach it to talk. Although these antics amused the public, they were not considered the main sensations. This role was filled by constant fights. One day, Reggie could break the jaw of a local villain for calling him a milksop, and the next day he and Ronnie were brandishing boarding sabers to chase a gang out of a bar they wanted money from. Anyone who wanted to get something from the new owners of the Regal was bound to failure. Such fame made the Twins' pool hall a haven for dozens of East End petty criminals, some of whom began to spend more and more time with the brothers. People began to consolidate around the Krays, and a kind of personal criminal organization began to emerge. They drank together, fought off bar attackers together, and made forays into foreign territories together to challenge local gangs. Although the latter was not yet an act of taking over a new sphere of influence, but was done for some strange entertainment. The action itself was prepared as a military operation. Ronnie paid money to local boys who spied on those who were to be attacked, and they reported all the information back to him. After that, roles were assigned between the participants. For example, if the fight was to take place in a bar, someone would arrive there in advance and sit under the guise of being a customer. Someone would enter from the front entrance and someone from the back. And when the battle began, the opponents were surrounded and had no choice to retreat. As one of the participants in such outings told John Pearson, the Kray brothers' biographer, even though the fight was essentially just for the sake of the fight, the twins fought as if their lives depended on it, as if the fields of World War II were all around them, not nighttime London. Knocking a man to the ground, they literally rammed his head into the floor without an ounce of compassion. Sometimes it seemed that they even enjoyed it, and if Ronnie took with him his favorite boarding saber, bought in an antique store, the guys on the other side of the barricades could not be envied. Their ingrained postulate of violence as the key to all doors was again bearing fruit for the twins. These raids and the successful defense of their bar gave them a reputation as ruthless, even crazy street fighters. More criminal elements began to reach out to the Kray brothers, and the Regal began to turn from the base of their small organization into a gathering place for dozens of thieves and robbers. Bandits brought the twins the loot, and those for a small percentage could hold it under their protection, while looking for a place to sell. The police did not yet know anything about the brothers' billiard room, and their reputation allowed them to act as guarantors for the safety of the booty. Very soon, their ever-growing acquaintances allowed the twins not only to take the goods on hold, but also bring together a thief and a fence, or the one who has a tip on the case and the direct executor, receiving in each case a percentage. The Krays became a kind of criminal guarantor. They were trusted, respected, and their authority in the criminal world was growing day by day. However, the big players did not yet take them seriously. For mature villains who controlled the streets or even entire neighborhoods, a couple of boys gathering local thieves in their billiard room did not arouse much interest. Although their wars with other small gangs, which in the end brought neither money nor territories, looked to the top of the criminal world as some kind of childishness. That all changed when the Krays began acting as a criminal guarantor and receiving a percentage of the profits. The gang that ran Mile End Street and a neighborhood called Poplar was interested in the venture. They wanted the Krays to start working for them and to pay a percentage of their earnings. And so that the twins understood the proposal, the leaders of the gang invited them to talk in one of the pubs under their control. When this invitation became known in the East End, it was rumored that the Krays' first serious defeat in a street fight would happen at this meeting. And it was no surprise that people thought this way. The ringleaders of that gang were three brothers who hadn't lost a single amateur boxing match while competing at heavyweight. While the twins were only two, they performed in the average and in addition lost in height to those guys by around 10 centimeters. Imagine the surprise of the criminal community when after the meeting came the news that the Kray brothers not only came out victorious from this fight, but beat their opponent so badly that one of them almost went to the grave, while the twins themselves got away with merely a few bruises and abrasions. It was a victory after which the criminal world of London could not ignore the Kray brothers. With them began to reckon not only petty thieves and robbers, but also mature villains of the East End. And once the authority was established, it was time to go beyond the billiard room and start earning much more money. Having won that fight, Ronnie and Reggie got the territory that the defeated rivals controlled, and with it, dozens of outlets that paid weekly. In the East End of that time, it was a matter of fact that the villain who controlled a certain territory received a small percentage from all the businesses in that territory for protection from small-time hoodlums. And considering that the people in the East End did not particularly complain about the police and small gangs were on the whole scattered, such protection was beneficial not only to the racketeers, but also to their victims. For a few pounds a week, they were able to work in peace. The the Kray brothers started to get paid from everything. Own a pub, pay the twins. Sell fruit, pay the twins. Run an illegal gambling club or betting shop, again, pay the twins. Earlier, they received interest from thieves on the condition of assistance, but now it was enough that the theft or robbery occurred on their territory. So if you stole, pay the twins. Robbed, pay the twins. Pulled a scam. I think you know what to do. And I think you also know what happens if you decide not to pay. In their early 20s, Ronnie and Reggie earned many times more than the vast majority of the East End. They had nice clothes, expensive jewelry, and their own cars. Ronald even had his own personal barber who cut his hair exclusively. But that wasn't enough for the twins. Their territory was extremely small. In order to expand their sphere of influence, the brothers needed to throw off the throne of two villains who controlled not only most of the East End, but also shared the rich West End. These criminal kings were called Jack Spot and Billy Hill. Gangs under their leadership for 10 years worked without open conflict. Both leaders preferred to solve serious issues by negotiating rather than guns blazing. But by 1955, it was beginning to look like such a long peace was about to collapse. Hill had become extremely suspicious over the years and saw betrayal everywhere, while Spot thought he was a nutcase and feared an attack. That's why Jack Spot came to the Kray brothers himself and invited them to go with him to the annual races in Epsom, where the entire top criminal world of London gathered. He wanted to lure them to his side, so that in case of open conflict, he'd be allies with one of the strongest groups of the East End. The twins accepted the invitation, but they were not going to play by Spot's rules. If the old gangster wanted to use the brothers as a deterrent from gang warfare, showing that he got the most badass East End group as allies and thus equalized the chances of eventual victory, the Krays, on the contrary, wanted to unleash on behalf of Spot the largest gangster conflict in London, and in the course of street battles be the first to destroy opponents and then crush nominal allies. Spot and Hill, however, did not let themselves be outdone. The conflict between them lasted a year and was confined to minor skirmishes, which were each time squashed by the old gangsters, as they realized that both would lose money over it. Eventually, tired of the situation, both gangsters retired in 1956, leaving the London underworld in a fractured state, and the twins' plan for a full-scale gang war had failed. Now it was impossible to clash the two strongest groups, and to challenge all the gangs at the same time was too much even by the standards of the brothers Kray. From a lightning blitzkrieg conquest for the criminal throne, the twins then turned to trench warfare. Fights and shootouts became a regular occurrence for the men of the firm. They then repelled the attacks of another gang, making their billiard room outpost or themselves attacked on the road that crossed the organization of bandits. Ronald liked this life most of all. He was constantly planning attacks and buying new weapons, recruiting new fighters, and expanding his network of underage spies. People in the organization for this even nicknamed him Colonel, and he more than lived up to his nickname. Ronnie did not lose any conflict and was beginning to feel invulnerable. That came back to him at the end of 1956 when the police stopped him in the car with a whole arsenal of weapons, among which was a knife. Which a couple of days prior severely wounded a man. The victim would later identify Ronald as his attacker and send the colonel by his testimony to prison for 3 years. This imprisonment separated the twins for the first time in such a long period of time, as well as clearly showing how different a mentality can be between two people who are indistinguishable outwardly. A couple of months after Ronnie was in the jail cell, the skirmishes with other gangs gradually died down. There was no longer a colonel who was always eager to fight. It turned out that the whole craving for violence's sake came from only one brother, and the second, as in his childhood, just did not want to appear in his eyes as a weakling. Perhaps it sounds silly, but except for the influence of one brother on the other, it is impossible to explain the changes that occurred. There were changes, and they were obvious. Reggie used less force and more bargaining and alliances. The ceased bloodshed freed up Reginald's extra money and free time, which he could spend on expanding his business. Together with his older brother Charlie, they bought several pubs, opened their own gambling club, and organized their own bookmaker's office. Reggie redirected the income that the firm received from racketeering into a legal or semi-legal direction, creating new profitable enterprises, the crowning achievement of which was a nightclub called 2 R's. Reginald created from this establishment the first elite club of the East End. Local hooligans and troublemakers were not allowed in, and inside everything was done according to the canons of the best clubs of the rich West End. So very soon various representatives of the upper class were drawn there, many of whom were not averse to making acquaintance with the successful owner of the famous club. For those couple of years while Ronnie was in prison, Reggie, without realizing it, made a very important step on the path of their criminal ascent. He made his first connections in high places. Without this tool, the attempt to spread his influence in the fashionable neighborhoods of London would certainly have failed. It was the East End that could be subdued by brute force alone. In the West End, a comprehensive approach was needed in which connections played no small part. And Reggie already had everything he needed to fully begin to spread his influence there. He planned to open several illegal gambling clubs in the West End, which his new acquaintances told him in confidence would soon become legal. The firm under his management looked more and more like a legal enterprise, and in a few years would certainly begin to bring its owners a good passive income, allowing them never to participate in street fights again. However, the Colonel was about to be released and was not satisfied at all with this development. While Reggie on the outside ran the business and enjoyed life, Ronnie in custody tried to cope with his own demons. At first, everything was fine. He was put in a maximum security prison near London, where Reggie and the guys from the firm often came to visit him. The people there were from the same world as Ronnie, so he felt like a fish in water and even made a new friend. That all changed when the Colonel was transferred to a less restrictive prison for good behavior. First, it was located much farther from London and Reggie could not visit him often. And secondly, the prisoners there were not hardened criminals and stayed away from him. Ronnie was alone for the first time in his life. Gradually, he became withdrawn. He stopped talking to other people, didn't write letters to his family or read books. He was always tense, as if expecting an attack. And for the same reason, he stopped taking food, telling the warders that it was poisoned. He did not sleep at night and sat in front of the mirror for hours, as if trying to figure out who he saw in the reflection. This behavior alarmed the prison administration, and they established constant surveillance of the Colonel, which was the last straw that led to a nervous breakdown. He lunged at the guards watching him, screaming that they could not kill him. As soon as possible, Ronnie was transferred to the psychiatric ward of Winchester Prison, where 3 days later his mother received an official letter. Your son, Ronald Kray, has been declared insane. A more precise diagnosis, which sounded like paranoid schizophrenia, was made at the Long Grove Psychiatric Hospital. Upon learning this, Reggie didn't believe the doctor's words. It seemed to him that his brother was just messing around, just like they had done during the army period in Kentbury. Therefore, he decided he could not leave Ronnie in the asylum and organized an escape. Once free, the Colonel felt better at first, but the fact that he had to hide all the time, as well as his refusal to take his prescribed medication, soon brought everything back to normal. He again began to suspect everyone around him of a conspiracy, stopped recognizing even Reggie, and finally tried to kill himself by slitting his wrists. This behavior of the Colonel convinced even Reggie that his brother needed medical attention. He and his mother persuaded Ronnie to return voluntarily to Long Grove. There he would remain until September 1958, when doctors deemed his condition normalized and allowed authorities to take Ronnie away to serve the remainder of his sentence. And in the spring of 1959, Colonel Ronnie Kray returned to the East End. The drugs prescribed by the doctors allowed him to look the same outwardly as before, but the ideas that were now born in his brain gave away the paranoid schizophrenic inside him with an endless thirst for violence. Upon learning that Reggie had made peace with almost all of his former enemies in his absence, Ronnie became enraged and began calling his brother a traitor. Within just a month, the Colonel had once again dragged the firm into endless conflicts with other gangs. As a result, in 1959, the Kray brothers received under their control almost all of the East End. And although now Reggie could forget about a quiet life and legal income, things in the organization could not be called deplorable. There were practically no gangs left in London which were ready to challenge the twins, and the money that brought racketeering would be enough until death. 4 years later, after the first attempt to usurp criminal power, the Kray brothers finally got what they wanted. The golden age of the Kray brothers was marked by their ownership of one of London's finest gambling establishments of the 1960s called Esmeralda's Barn. Ronnie, in one of his eternal crusades, ran into a successful businessman named Peter Rahman, who, in order to pay off the twins, gave the name of the real owner of the barn, which was not difficult to find. The owner of the Esmeralda, who heard about the brothers, immediately agreed to sell his institution. Approximately from here begins the story of the Kray brothers, which was told in the movie Legend. And since many people know of them from that movie, I will make some remarks of conformity hereafter, for the narrative in the movie was distorted for the sake of artistic license. After the takeover of the Esmeralda, Reggie Kray did receive a 1.5-year sentence and the management of the firm fell to Ronnie, but it would be wrong to assume that the colonel during this period brought the brothers' business and the Esmeralda barn in particular to a deplorable state. In fact, things were a bit different than the authors of Legend have shown. Yes, Ronald was a psycho who loved violence, but he was by no means a fool, as shown in the movie. Whereas Reggie wanted to lead the firm to financial success, Ronnie was only interested in power, so it's not surprising that the business in the absence of Reginald began to suffer monetary losses, but at the same time, the colonel managed to strengthen the influence of the twins both on the streets and in high circles. The decline of the barn Esmeralda was not really due to the fact that Ronnie's behavior scared away all the visitors, but with the fact that he began to give out too much credit. The institution could not complain about the number of players, but only paid a few on lost bets. From a respectable club, Esmeralda turned into a collection of gamblers and gangsters who constantly owed Ronnie Kray. The colonel liked that dozens of people were indebted to him. When things at the club became quite bad, the guys from the firm knocked out gambling debts from particularly persistent defaulters. It was a special form of entertainment invented by Ronnie Kray. But even if the colonel, with his amusements, destroyed all the legal earnings of the firm, the brothers would always have a racket in the East End, where the hard hand of Ronnie in the absence of Reggie only increased the influence. It was these funds that allowed Ronald to lead the life of an extravagant playboy. By this time, he openly acknowledged his homosexuality and began to appear in public with his boys. The colonel developed another passion besides his love of violence. He liked to be the center of attention. Ronnie went to the best restaurants and clubs in London, poured money, and willingly accepted the companionship of high society. And his open homosexuality allowed him to make dozens of acquaintances with fellow travelers, some of whom even sat in the House of Lords. So Reggie, who came out of prison, saw before him not a broken trough, but the ruins of the legal part of the business he had built, on which lay the opportunity for the erection of a much larger project, to which he promptly set about. The balance sheet was brought back into the firm. Ronnie, Yin, wanted more and more power and violence. And Reggie, Yang, understood how to turn the growing power into money. In the first month after his return, Reginald managed to rein in his brother and began to clean out Esmeralda's barn of the players on credit, briefly improving the situation of the establishment, and then arranged a large-scale expansion of racketeering gambling establishments, taking under the protection of the firm almost all of the casinos in London, using a minimum of violence. The authority of the brothers by this time was such that the mere mention of Kray's name was enough to get what they wanted. Therefore, it is not surprising that when the legalization of gambling activities in London began to attract gangsters from other countries, it was the Kray brothers that began to engage in the protection of their establishments. The most famous partner of the twins in this kind of cooperation was the boss of the Philadelphia mafia family, Angelo Bruno. At first, the firm worked with the mafia as with other owners of gambling establishments, receiving a fixed fee for protection. But then, when guests from across the ocean felt the ground and decided to increase the flow of investment, the twins began to receive a percentage of the profits of each casino while helping to open new establishments. Another type of cooperation was that the Kray brothers helped their Italian counterparts to sell stolen bonds in Canada for a total of $2 million, receiving, according to various reports, from 50 to 75% of the profits. They were assisted in this by a man named Leslie Payne. There is no exact data when exactly Leslie joined the firm, but at the time of the purchase of Esmeralda's bar, he was already with the twins and helped them settle legal matters. Payne was a businessman who had lost 14 of his businesses due to a series of circumstances and was now something of an accountant and economic advisor to the Kray brothers. It was Payne who had the idea for a fraudulent scheme that brought in up to 10% of the firm's total revenues. The essence was that the twins found a proven person who, in case of arrest, would keep his mouth shut and registered a wholesale trading company for him. The established company rented a warehouse, advertised in newspapers, and hired employees, creating the image of a functioning enterprise. The nominal owner of the company would then go to a bank and make a deposit as working capital. Then, he used this deposit as payment to suppliers for their goods, which were immediately sold at stores at a reduced price, and the money received was returned to the bank. When the suppliers and the bank began to trust this firm, the maximum possible credit was taken from the bank, the deposit was withdrawn, and all this money was used to purchase the maximum amount of goods from suppliers, which were then sold to stores at half price for cash. And of course, as soon as the warehouse was empty, the owner of the company immediately disappeared into an unknown direction, giving the lion's share of all the money to the firm Kray. All this fraud and racketeering brought the brothers fabulous money, and Ronnie, with all his desire and wastefulness, could not spend it all. Reggie again began to realize his dream of transferring the business into a legal direction. He, together with Payne, laundered money through gambling establishments and clubs, then invested it in the purchase of pubs, opening new casinos and betting shops, nightclubs, and other legitimate businesses, the most significant of which were the acquisitions of the Kentucky and Cambridge Rooms nightclubs. The opening of both establishments were accompanied by noisy parties which were attended by all the high society of London, which outside the opening of the clubs were not squeamish about having communication with the twins. Being among famous actors, singers, boxers, and even politicians, the Kray brothers could not avoid publicity. For the mass public, they were successful businessmen, and if there were any opinions that the twins were not quite law-abiding citizens, they were immediately drowned out by the hail of donations that Ronnie and Reggie made on a regular basis. They gave money to orphanages and hospitals, supported nursing homes and schools. If you read the newspapers of those years, you might get the impression that the Kray brothers were almost saintly people. And they happily supported this view, which did not waver even after the public scandal in which the Speaker of Parliament, Lord Boothby, was accused of having homosexual relations with Ronald Kray. It is worth saying that at the time, such an accusation could carry a real prison sentence. The essence of the case was that in 1964, the Sunday Mirror published a damning article, which would later prove to be true, accusing Lord Boothby and Ronald Kray of having an indecent affair. A few weeks later, the Times published an open letter from Lord Boothby, in which he, having fudged the facts, smashed the Sunday Mirror's thesis and threatened a libel suit if they did not provide substantial evidence of their words. And since the journalists had no proof, they had to issue an apology article, take back all their words, and pay Boothby £40,000. And also to stop all their journalistic investigations related to the criminal activity of the brothers, because of the danger of legal consequences, as the continuation of attacks on Ronnie after a public apology to him could cause no less hype. And the lack of solid evidence would have again forced the newspaper to pay a lot of money for committing libel. Almost immediately after the scandal, Kray was attacked again, this time not by journalists, but by law enforcement. It was extremely difficult to get close to the well-connected brothers from a legal point of view, but the police officer Nipper Reed almost succeeded. He found a man named Hugh McCohen, who was willing to testify against the twins that they were demanding 50% of his club's profits, which was confirmed by the arrest of a Kray brothers man named Teddy Smith, who had wreaked havoc at McCohen's club. Ronald and Reginald were immediately taken into custody, but Reed could not have imagined the opposition he would face. First, the brothers hired London's best criminal defense lawyers. Secondly, they petitioned the House of Lords for bail, which was denied, and which Lord Boothby vehemently supported at the hearing. And thirdly, they bribed several jurors, and since at that time in England, one negative vote in a jury meant a retrial, it gave time for a private detective hired by the brothers to learn that McCohen had been in several cases as a police informer, making him an unreliable witness. Therefore, the retrial was concluded with a full acquittal of the twins. And the cherry on the cake was that an angry Nipper Reed dropped into the brothers' acquittal party to confront the scoundrels who had eluded him. He did, of course, look them in the eye, but then was immediately transferred to another duty station, as Scotland Yard began to receive dozens of letters that Reed was seen at the same party with the Kray brothers. Needless to say, the letters came from the twins themselves. After the previously described success of the brothers on all fronts, you may have some logical questions. What was Ronnie doing at that time? Did Reggie really succeed in quieting his crazy brother? Was he really just enjoying life all this time? Yes and no. He'd enjoyed life to the fullest, but his paranoid tendencies and lust for violence hadn't gone away. At one time, he might have been fine, even helping his brother with business matters, and then there would be a sudden mood swing and he could go off to live in a van in the middle of the woods for a couple of months. Or he could be serious about going to the Congo to search for ancient treasures. He even wanted to create the largest assassination squad in the history of criminal organizations and coordinate its actions around the world. And although after a while this idea left his brain, as well as many others, Ronnie was still engaged in expanding his army of fighters. Ronnie found a legal job, because of which it was difficult for the police to identify new members of the gang. In parallel, as the army of fighters grew and the network of spies of the Colonel, which turned from a bunch of local boys to dozens of petty criminals, bartenders, cab drivers, and other people who heard a lot of things around. If anyone had valuable information, Ronnie was happy to buy it. Anyone who didn't want to participate in the firm's affairs, but wanted the favor of the brothers, gladly shared with the Colonel everything they heard. The only problem was, Ronnie had nowhere to use his ever-expanding army. There were no gangs left in London that were willing to engage the twins in a full-scale war. All Ronald had to settle for were minor conflicts. Someone got into a bar fight with a member of the firm, or speak ill of the brothers. The Colonel, recognizing this, immediately deployed an operation to find such an impudent insolent, and then personally punished him. Usually, such inquisition consisted of a beating and stabbing, without going as far as full-blown murder. The first in a long time who allowed Ronnie to go beyond petty squabbles and taste a full-fledged gang war again was the Richardson faction. There were several reasons for this conflict. The first was personal animosity. In the Richardson gang, there were several members with whom Ronnie had old scores. They were Frankie Frazier, who had been at odds with the brothers since the conflict between Spot and Hill, and remained alive until now only thanks to a prison sentence. And George Cornell, who had previously been a member of the twins' broken gang called the Watney Street Boys, and was now often vocal in his negative comments about Ronnie's sexual orientation. The second reason was that the Richardsons were beginning to expand into the twins' territory, which created an economic conflict of interest. The third reason was that the Richardsons had absolutely no fear of the Kray brothers and sent Ronnie and Reggie away in response to demands to stop expanding. The Colonel finally received the long-awaited summons. All of the firm's fighters immediately received weapons, and the network of informers now worked exclusively in one direction. Ronnie contacted the leaders of every gang that had ever been affected by the Richardsons and formed a military alliance with them. And when all forces were mobilized, he began to prepare a plan of attack, which, however, was never implemented. Richardson fell into the hands of the police during a shootout with another gang, not involved in any way in the conflict with the Krays. The only one who managed to avoid arrest was George Cornell, and Ronnie unleashed all his anger on him. He killed Cornell in the pub in front of a dozen witnesses, thus eliminating the last key member of the Richardson gang. These were the last serious rivals for the firm. The Krays had finally taken the throne of London's crime kings, but as it often happens, the virtues that help a man climb to the top may turn out to be completely unsuitable to help him stay there. The Cornell murder was such a high-profile event that even the twins themselves doubted that they would be able to get away with it. The whole East End knew that Ronnie was the shooter, so the brothers went to Morocco for a while. However, the wall of silence did not give a crack, and as soon as the case was closed for lack of evidence, the Krays immediately returned back to England, where waiting for them was an unpleasant surprise. The way Ronnie had dealt with Cornell had frightened not only potential enemies, but allies as well. Leslie Payne, while the brothers were in Morocco, left town and stayed out of touch. And many gambling establishment owners began to offer annual revenues just to avoid dealing with the firm. People within the organization began to fear that Ronnie's uncontrolled aggression could affect them as well. To redeem their authority, first of all in front of their own people, the twins wanted to showcase the escape of Ronnie's prison friend Frank Mitchell, nicknamed the Mad Logger. Mitchell was serving time without a definite release date, and this escape was a way to draw attention to him so that the authorities would finally set an exact date. On December 12, 1966, the woodcutter left prison and taken by men from the firm to an apartment in London. There, Mitchell would stay for a little over 10 days, during which time he would write several open letters, which would then be published in major newspapers in England. In these letters, the logger appealed to the authorities with the condition that he would return back to prison only when he knew the exact date of his release. The brothers' plan did not work, however, as there was no response to the letters. Mitchell, who was constantly confined within four walls, became increasingly nervous. He took away a gun from one of the men of the firm who guarded him and began to threaten the twins that if they did not fulfill their promise, he would never return to prison and would go on the run, which Kray could not allow. And in the end, a plan that began as a restoration of authority only resulted in its deterioration. On December 24, 1966, Frank Mitchell was taken from his London apartment to an unknown destination, after which he was never seen again. This case was even worse for the Krays than the murder of Cornell. Even if George was killed in front of everyone, he was still the enemy, but Mitchell was one of his own. And if we add this to the fact that Ronnie, having lost tangible enemies, began to invent fictional enemies, making lists of people who could potentially betray him, or those who could avenge the people he had killed, often adding guys far from both the former and the latter, the distrust and fear of his own people only continued to grow. To the problems within the firm were also added the troubles in Reggie's personal life. In general, the relationship between Reggie and Frances, on which a great deal of reliance is placed in almost all movies about the twins, actually fits into a few sentences. The girl fell in love with a gangster who, during the courtship period, did not show the inner workings of his business. And when, after the wedding, the true face of the lover was revealed, the girl could not stand all the madness going on around her, and since after a dozen attempts to leave her husband, nothing worked out, she fell into a depression of dissatisfaction with her life and committed suicide. And if you look at how Reggie experienced this event, it is likely that he had really strong feelings for her. He went on a deep bender immediately after the funeral and became no less explosive and unpredictable than Ronnie. A couple of times, he tried to kill Frances's brother for allegedly setting her up with him, but changed his mind at the last minute each time. In his drunken delirium, he began to listen more and more to Ronnie's crazy ideas and once almost killed an innocent man whom the colonel had accused of mistreating Frances. Wherever Reggie appeared, something was bound to happen. He could shoot a man in the leg, slash his face with a knife, or beat him half to death for no reason. Drowning his sorrows in alcohol, Reggie became an exact replica of his psychopathic brother, causing the firm to descend further into endless violence, culminating in another landmark murder. The victim was one of the firm's gunmen, Jack McVitie, nicknamed Hat. Jack worked with the twins for quite some time and had done quite a lot of dirty work for them. His only flaw was his drinking, during which he was completely unaware of himself and did crazy things. But McVitie liked Reggie, and so he got away with it. Until the moment when he fell into one of the twins' pubs with a shotgun, threatening to kill his brothers. This news reached Ronnie the very next day, and it could be considered that the fate of McVitie from that moment was already predetermined. Jack Hat was lured to the apartment where the twins were waiting for him. After a brief struggle, he was killed by a series of stabbings and disappeared from the East End forever. With the death of McVitie Hat, the firm finally became an isolated world of violence and distrust. Those who left the brothers' organization out of fear for their lives received constant threats and reminders to keep quiet. And those who stayed with the twins only clung to them for the money and were ready to jump ship at the first serious threat. However, the Kray brothers didn't really care about these changes anymore. Reggie was still getting over Frances's death and had little involvement in the firm's affairs. And Ronnie, even in the good years, had invented a lot of traitors. All that had changed for him now was that they had become a reality. Under such circumstances, Reggie could no longer or would no longer try to curb Ronnie's obsessions, and the colonel began to realize his vision for the future of the firm. He found common ground in this matter with Alan Cooper, the man who had helped the twins sell bonds after Leslie Payne left the firm. Cooper was an extremely murky businessman. Officially, he was the owner of a private bank, But in the criminal world, he was known as a smuggler who helped smuggle gold to the Far East, as well was involved in some arms deals. Cooper enthusiastically supported Ronnie's ideas to expand the firm's business on a global scale. He promised to connect him with suppliers of weapons and drugs, describing in colors how much money it would bring and how much it would increase the power of the twins. To confirm his words, he even took Ronnie to Paris and New York, where he introduced him to local gangsters. All this gave the feeling that things were not really as bad as they may seem. But the feeling was false, because the increased violence began to attract to the twins the close attention of Scotland Yard, which organized a secret investigation headed by Nipper Reed, a man who at one time was the closest to the brothers. This time, Reed was supported by his superiors, who were ready to give him full support. Nipper took advantage of this and set 2 conditions. The first, he himself recruits a team. The second, the investigation in Scotland Yard should be known only to senior management. His team of 14 was placed in a separate room where they were officially investigating police corruption. The first thing that Reed did was go through the former members of the firm, and although this act did not bring any direct results, and in addition completely exposed the secrecy of the operation, the indirect influence allowed Nipper to get one of the most important witnesses. The rumor of Reed's return spread across the East End with breakneck speed and reached Leslie Payne, who, after his departure from the firm, the brothers made an attempt on his life. Payne himself contacted Nipper and told him everything he knew about the Kray brothers' activities. Reed had dozens of names of people involved in the firm's affairs, as well as hundreds of names of those who had suffered from the twins' activities. The problem was that the people who gave testimony flatly refused to confirm them in court, so long as the brothers had even the slightest chance to take revenge on them. So Nipper had to document all the witnesses and assure them that their names would not appear in the case until the Krays and their associates were behind bars. He needed a serious indictment against the brothers that would isolate them behind bars and then include dozens of depositions on other charges. And after a short period of time, Reed got that chance. The police arrested, accompanied by 4 sticks of dynamite, an assassin who was fulfilling an order for the firm. The killer told detectives everything he knew about the activities of the brothers, as well as surrendered the client, who was Alan Cooper. Imagine Reed's surprise when, called for questioning, Cooper told him that he worked for the U.S. intelligence services and was introduced to the brothers Kray with the permission of Scotland Yard. It was decided to use Cooper as a secret agent in this case, but somehow the Krays learned of the connection between Reed and Cooper and ended contact with the latter. It was beginning to seem that the case would not progress beyond dozens of secret witnesses and the Kray brothers would remain at large. So Nipper Reed decided to take a risk and used the testimony of Cooper, the assassin, and Leslie Payne as the primary prosecution. And at 6 a.m. on May 8, 1968, 25 key members of the firm, including Ronald and Reginald Kray, were simultaneously detained. For the first time after the arrests, people were still afraid to testify against the twins, as there were a couple of important thugs of the firm still at large. But as soon as they were put behind bars, the wall of silence collapsed. To the existing witnesses were added a couple dozen more, among whom were also former members of the firm. In the end, the court was able to prove the murders of Cornell and McVitie, as well as dozens of other offenses. And on March 8, 1969, Ronald and Reginald Kray were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole for 30 years. Ronald Kray served 26 years of his sentence and died of a heart attack in 1955. Reginald Kray served 31 years and was released 35 days before he died of cancer on October 1, 2000. During their time in prison, each of the brothers wrote their own autobiography, and the names Ronnie and Reggie Kray were regularly in the press until their deaths. More than 30 books have been written about the twins, and about 10 movies based on their life story have been made. This was the story of Ronald and Reginald Kray, a story that was impossible to believe the first time around. That's probably why they're called the criminal legends of England. Where else but in legend can a paranoid schizophrenic with a penchant for violence and a failed world boxing champion become the criminal kings of London?